Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Mediterranean seminar of 2021. My name is Defne Gönenç. I'm working as a researcher at the Center for Mediterranean Studies of Yaşar University. So today you will be talking about Chinese green investments in the Mediterranean Sea. So as you know, China is being increasingly present in the Mediterranean Sea. This is true for both southern coast of Europe and also northern coast of Africa. I think we are hearing some voices from, how is it possible? Oh, okay. Yes, now this is good. Yes, this is better. Sorry for the, technical, problems. So when we go back to the topic, so the topic today is China and Chinese green investments in the Mediterranean Sea. As you know, China is being, increasingly present in the Mediterranean Sea because they are heavily investing in big, development projects such as in the transport sector, energy sector, and also telecommunications sector. This is actually part of their, very famous Belt and Road Initiative, which started in 2013. It is containing 70 countries and it's a mega infrastructure development plan and it's stretching from East Asia until Europe. If I'm, mistaken, Ceren Hoca will, correct me later on. And today, particularly, we will be touching about a part of this initiative, which is called Maritime Silk Road. And this is also a major development plan. And the aim is to reinvigorate the historical Silk Road and the historical ancient port cities. So our topic will focus on Chinese green investment as a part of this Maritime Silk Road and also, of course, its environmental consequences. And for discussing this very important topic, we are welcoming two, very distinguished speakers. We have our, guest speaker, Ceren Ergenç, from China, actually. She's an associate professor in the Department of Chinese Studies at Xi'an Jiatong Liverpool University. I hope I'm, pronouncing it properly. I try my best. Well, before actually, she held, various positions. She worked in Turkey as well. She worked in the Middle East Technical University, and she also held visiting professorship at Peking University, Renmin University, and Fudan University. And she has a PhD from Boston University, political science major. And her research interests are Chinese studies. She also covers East Asia, comparative studies. Also, she from time to time contributes to Duvar Gazete Duvar. If there are some, audience among us that is following this Gazete newspaper as well. We are so welcome, Ceren. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And as a discussant, we also have Veysal Tekdal from Eskişehir Osman Gazi University. He already completed his PhD. He has his PhD from Middle East Technical University in Turkey. He's now working as a research assistant at Eskişehir Osman Gazi University. He is also focusing and researching about Chinese studies. He's also specializing in neo-Gramscian theories. So before we start, let me mention you a little bit about our structure today. So for around 40-45 minutes, we will be, listening to Ceren Hoca, Ceren Ergenç. And following that, we will have a question and answer session for around 10 to 15 minutes between Ceren and Veysal. And after that, we will open the floor to the different questions. If you're interested in, you can you are very welcome to write down your question onto our YouTube wall. On the right hand side, you will notice the wall, and we will voice your question to Ceren. And for half an hour, it will be an open discussion. So now the floor is Ceren's. Thank you very much, Ceren, again for joining us today.
Thank you again. I guess I can share screen here, right?
Yes, you are very welcome.
Okay. Okay. So hello, everyone. This is a very hot topic these days, right? China's President Xi Jinping announced China's pledge for carbon neutrality by 2060 in the United Nations General Assembly in last November 2020. And previously, China had agreed to green transition on the BRI at the EU-China Climate Summit earlier in October 2020. And domestically, again, around the same time, China registered the highest amount of wind energy production with a record hike in December, a development that stuns the environmental observers. And for this year, even though we are at the very beginning of the year still, low carbon is one of the goals of the 14th five-year plan that's going to be announced in March 2021. And after that, there will be Belt and Road BRI Forum in April, and then the UN Biodiversity Conference in May. So when we look at these recent developments, seems to be emerging as a climate leader. So is that the case? And if that's the case, how so? So today we'll be talking about that. And just to draw the framework for today's discussion, as well, Defne also said, I'm a domestic politics, or even local politics person, actually, with a growing interest in the politics behind China's so-called, in a way, green transformation. And what I mean with this green transformation is the production and consumption of green technologies and green investments, both domestically and internationally. And today I'll talk about China's political economy that enables this double transformation, if I may. Also, hopefully from a political ecology perspective, as much as possible. I'm saying as much as possible because there's not much empirical work done on that yet. So maybe today's this can provide some pathways for further empirical research and theoretical discussion about that. On that vein, what I'm going to talk about today is a part of a broader ongoing project with several other colleagues, actually, about the BRI's role in state transformation and region making with a case study on the Eastern Mediterranean as an emerging region, as a sub-region of the Mediterranean, let's say. And as a part of this broader project, today I will focus on the factors and actors that shape China's behavior and perceptions in this multidimensional and dynamic relationship. Let me lay out my arguments before we set out to talk about several interrelated issue areas. So I argue that China's BRI is not and not meant to be a coherent top-down strategy, but a dynamic interaction among many actors. And it's greening the BRI strategy reflects that. Even though China is now the leading green technology producer and financer, and it is now committed to carbon neutrality by 2060, it is not a single track policy. It is partly because of the famous policy pragmatism of the reformer leaders, or we can say that it is like the party state's response to socio-economic crises, either at home or at the global scale, regional global scales. But it's also an outcome of a pluralist and contested policy space in China. So that brings me to my second argument, that greening BRI, or in other words, China's goal to be a leading green producer and financer at the global scale, is a reflection of its domestic politics. In order to understand who on BRI gets to be green and on what terms and why China behaves in the ways that it behaves in the Mediterranean, as our case study today, we need to look at the domestic roots of China's foreign policy and the BRI in particular. So in this presentation, I will first introduce the domestic policy sphere that shapes the BRI from China's side, in order to set the background for this argument. Then I will talk about the green transformation of China domestically, since I see this as a double transformation, right? Like a domestic and international green transformation linked together. Then I'll switch my gaze to the transnational scale and discuss what color is the BRI, metaphorically speaking. So it's like, is it green, really, like talking about green transformations, or is it rather gray, given the coal investments, or is it brown, given the side effects of the hydropower investment? To reiterate my point, my main argument, the BRI is not single colored, continuing the same metaphor, right? It's not only green versus gray or brown, but it is actually multicolored. And we need to look at the domestic politics for explanations for that. And finally, time permits, I'll give a couple of examples from the Mediterranean region to empirically demonstrate my point. So now, China is the second largest economy in the world since the second half of the 2000s. It is the world's largest bilateral creditor and the only major world economy to record economic growth in 2020. We should look at the policy process in the party states to understand how that happens. Now, I define China as a neoliberal developmentalist party state. This long definition borrows from multiple literature, and let me explain myself from beginning from the end to the beginning, actually. So let's start with the party state. So with that part, it's kind of obvious, right? Like it still maintains the Leninist party state structure, right? But that has several outcomes for its policy decisions and the state capacity. One is the central leadership, the central government has a disproportional power in policymaking, even though not necessarily in policy implementation, as it is, China is also a de facto federal state, given its geographical diversity. Still, the central government develops and funds major developmental projects beyond the market mechanism. And the second consequence of like still being a party state is the policy agendas of the leadership generations are shaped by how the rulers are selected. So the leaders of China, the central leadership, come to power for a 10-year tenure each that allows them to pursue more or less coherent policy agendas in the absence of a dominant ideology in the post-Mao years, post-Mao era. So China's reform era ideology, again, metaphorically speaking, are like simply wealth and power. Anyway, so these are the implications of still being a party state. Then comes the developmentalist part. China is the Asian tigers, if you remember, of the earlier decades, like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and whatnot. And within this Asian developmental state framework, the state guides and supports the private businesses in certain policy directions and industrial development in particular. And China's reform era leadership, in plural, learned from the Asian tigers both successes and replicate some of the formulas. The mega projects, industrial projects in artificial intelligence, for example, or the green technologies we discussed today are cases in point for that. Okay, but then being an Asian developmentalist state, in my opinion, doesn't make China a state capitalism in its pure form, if there's such thing, as some other scholars argue. In my opinion, it is nevertheless a neoliberal state for many reasons. One of them is that the private sector is a relevant actor in China's political industrial complex. The state steps in during the crisis times, but the business sector dominates during the post-crisis recovery period. And China embraces financialization of production and monetary markets. With more state regulation than the Asian developmentalist states before the Asian financial crisis, and definitely more than the Atlantic model of neoliberalism, which was once dubbed as Washington consensus, if there's anything left of it, but by way of comparison. And the labor and social security regimes are precarious in China, and shadow banking and P2P borrowing are rampant. And this point is directly related to the role of local governments and SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, in the Belt and Road investments. So within this framework of neoliberal developmental party states, China's leadership generations have different emphases. For example, the Deng Xiaoping era in the 80s were liberalization of the investment and trade systems. And the Jiang era was marked with integration into financial markets. The Hu era with the Council, and the current Xi Jinping era is with industrial upgrading and internationalization. And we see in this era the emergence of mega projects such as, well, obviously the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and the green transformation as well. So the emergence of the BRI or the consolidation of the BRI as branding of the BRI, I guess, as a grand strategy during the Xi Jinping era is a perfect case in point for how China's domestic concerns shape its foreign policy. The BRI is the latest stage and the branding of a policy that has been gradually developing since the last years of Jiang's tenure, for about like 20 something years. The BRI can be traced back to two domestic policies, Go West and Go Global. So Go West it has its roots in a Deng Xiaoping era China, and its preference for a two-track development policy. So what is this two-track development policy? So Deng Xiaoping decided that China was too big to develop all at the same time, like India, for example. So there had to be some delay in the development of certain regions. So the coastal regions were given the priority, given their historical infrastructural advantages. And the rest would have a spillover effect from the development of the eastern region. But that expected spillover effects didn't happen in inland China, in the hinterland, due to the lack of infrastructure and skilled human resources in Western and Central. The government decided to trigger growth in the inland China through region-specific development plans. Today, we have two rounds of region-specific plans, and the Go West strategy is the predecessor of those. The strategy was to enable foreign and coastal Chinese investments in underdeveloped Western regions to prevent social unrest and other socio-economic problems. Connecting the Western regions with neighboring countries with whom they share geo-economic similarities beyond the borders of the nation states dates back to this Go West strategy. And now, if we look at the maritime and hinterland transportation routes within the BRI, we can see that the Western provinces are matched with the BRI partners in their geo-economic regions, such as Central Asia and Southeast Asia, in the way that it was envisioned by this Go West policy. And again, Go West policy was primarily a domestic for the socio-economic development and stability of China. The second one is the Go Global strategy that goes hand in hand with Go West and constitutes the two historical pillars of BRI today. So the exponential economic growth in the early decades of the reform era created an overcapacity problem, especially for the local SOEs, state-owned enterprises in China. The Go Abroad strategy, launched at the eve of China's entry to the WTO, was to encourage Chinese private businesses and SOEs to move their investments abroad. Now you can see the link, right? The BRI investments still reflect this domestic economic concern. A significant portion of the BRI investments are deemed either unnecessary, like a waste of resources without much return, or shadow deals to solve the liquidity problem of the Chinese firms back home. So in other words, a lot of the BRI, the overseas investments within the BRI framework are actually to save the domestic economy rather than a big, coherent, top-down international policy, basically. And it also explains why the majority of the investors within the BRI framework are SOEs, because SOEs are the ones that needed to be rescued by the central state in the current state of economy in China, in domestic economy. The fact that the BRI is born out of two previous central level domestic policies does not make it a top-down and per-plan strategy, as I said. This top-national interpretation of central policies play an important role both domestically and internationally. The local governments engage with the BRI in their own terms. To give a couple of examples, and I'm going to give examples later on in relation to the Mediterranean region as well, but now just to set the background, the Western provinces, for example. The southwestern provinces, such as Yunnan and Guangxi, proved to be more successful in developing their own BRI engagements than the northwestern ones, such as Xinjiang and Gansu. And Veysal, our discussant, I'm sure would have a lot to say about that. That's his claim of fame, let's say. There are both infrastructural and political reasons for such disparity within West China, but maybe we can come back to that later in the Q&A session. So another example is from the coastal China. The Jiangsu province, the private companies in the Jiangsu province, a very developed province in East Coast, are involved in many special economic zone projects in the BRI, such as in Sri Lanka, because they have experience in CEZ development domestically. Or, for example, another example from, again, coastal China, Wenzhou, shapes China's engagement with, to give an example from the Mediterranean, Italy and France within the BRI. And Minier talks about that in her brilliant book. I strongly recommend that if you're interested in the development of the BRI as a domestic state project of China. So going back to Wenzhou, after this little advertisement about the literature I like, The Windsor diaspora makes the relationship trade heavy, while the Italian governments are clear, well, the current Italian government at least, clearly wants infrastructure investment from China. Another example is again from coastal China. Ningbo attracts high-tech investments thanks to the BRI, attracts high-tech investments internally to Ningbo. And it's a positive example because it's in coastal China, but there are many cities within China that are not performing as well as Ningbo, but still use the same strategy of using the AIB and CDB funds. And AIB and CDB are like the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the World Bank equivalent of BRI, and CDB, China's development bank, and use their funds. These like underperforming local governments encourage, or the local governments use these funds to bail out the local SOEs at the verge of bankruptcy under the disguise of BRI collaboration. That is, I think, a super interesting connection between the domestic and international. Now, if you move, if it's clear, like how the BRI is inherently related to China's domestic political economy, maybe we can talk a bit about China's domestic green transformation. So, China is constantly accused of contributing to global environmental degradation, as you probably know, and causing climate change, since its opening up triggered tremendous economic growth. Contrary to previous trends, China lately appears to be championing the production and the use of environmentally friendly technologies. Currently, the Chinese state engages in bilateral deals within the framework of the BRI to increase the financial value of this technology. The change in China's attitude took place in a two-stage process. In the 2000s, the environmental protests in China domestically became an issue for the government, for the central government and all the local governments, despite that they were mostly not in my backyard type of protests. Still, China survived this phase by forcing the local governments to include environmental protection in their performance criteria, and perhaps even more importantly, by enlisting, if not co-opting, the local environmental NGOs in the development of the markets for environmentally friendly technology. And I guess you see where I'm going from here. As a part of the cooperation process, the state transferred environmental protection projects to NGOs and the private sector. This transformation has created a niche industry for privately owned consultancy firms that develop and implement environmentally friendly technologies. And this domestic sector now constitutes the private businesses investing in green technologies in the higher income countries in Western Europe and the Asia Pacific. It's a prime example, I think, of how China's domestic developments shape its BRI engagement. Anyways, going back to China's own green transformation, its struggle with environmental protection has recently reached a third stage. As a global economic player, China is now reinventing itself as a constructive actor in environmental issues and global warming in particular. As we know, lately, China has taken steps to align its domestic and BRI investment goals with the needs of green economy. Economically speaking, China has not volunteered its support for the fight against climate change solely for environmentally friendly values. While its support for the Paris Agreement wins the country the legitimacy in the international community, China concurrently has become the primary producer of the most profitable fields in green technology. These green technologies include wind, electric cars, waste recycling, and decontamination of rivers and seas. So pretty much all the fields that China was culprit of polluting decades ago. Now it is the primary producer of technologies to undo the harm that it had given in the earlier decades, right? China's share in these sectors is more than the sum of both the United States and the European Union. So basically, in short, China dominates the green technology market. And not only the market of the production markets, but the finance markets as well. Green investments has created its own financial markets. And the green bonds, not only in China, but globally, yield the highest return rates. And China is now engaged in this global green finance field, claiming that green financial markets will encourage private investors to invest in environmentally friendly technology. In other words, we can suspect that green investments serves the purpose of creating new investment fields. I think that we can make this argument not only for China, but for globally for other actors as well. But let's focus on China. For example, the Bank of China announced that they are considering incorporating clean coal among the technologies that green bonds can fund. And immediately after this announcement, Trump administration in the States also seconded that clean coal is actually a great idea, which of course gave a major heart attack to the environmental activists, because obviously it defies the purpose of environmental friendly capital accumulation, right? So another example why China is in the green business for other purposes, for purposes other than normative values, or also reasons, let's say. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang reiterates the centrality of coal for China's energy production every time President Xi Jinping makes a pledge for transition to renewable technologies. This is not necessarily a manifestation of an internal conflict within the central government, even though, of course, admittedly, the energy policy sphere in China is a very conflictual one. But still, it is not necessarily an internal conflict, but a pragmatic strategy, in my opinion, to please all stakeholders involved. While the central government has plans to develop clean coal technologies and dominate the electric car markets, for example, in the next 5 years, I mean, they will be in the next 5-year plan, most definitely, I think, in March, as two of the priority areas of the central government. In the meantime, the local governments lobby or go behind the central government to keep the coal-operated energy plants, because A, coal mining creates employment, and B, coal plants produce cheap energy, cheap electricity, cheap power for SOEs and SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And this is particularly important in the post-pandemic recovery period. And please keep in mind that poverty alleviation is one of Xi Jinping's priority areas for the next 5-year plan as well. So they all, in a way, come together. That was China's domestic green transformation, right? So let's look at how this green transformation fits in the BRI. Okay, so I'm going to first start talking about the energy sector, and then we'll narrow down to the green energy, the renewables. Okay, so the BRI consists mostly of transportation energy investments, as you can also see from the charts. In 2020, 5 billion overseas energy sector finance was provided by China's 2 development banks with global operations. One, the CDP, we already talked about that, and the other one is the Export-Import Bank of China. This represents a continued decrease from the 8 billion in lending to foreign countries recorded in 2019, which is understandable given the pandemic conditions, of course. But despite the contraction in energy financing, CDB and the Export-Import Bank of China still provided approximately the same level of energy finance as the World Bank in 2020. So these are like serious commitments on China's side, right? And the energy sector finance provided by these two banks since 2000, the last 2 decades, basically, now totals to $250 billion, right? In terms of regional distribution, lending to African countries remain high, and the percentage of loans to South Asia and Southeast Asia remain the same, whereas lending to Europe, Central Asia, and Latin America decreased in recent years with the contraction of China's own economy. The majority of China's energy investment within the BRI framework goes to oil and coal. So see, we are talking about like China's energy investment, but we're not necessarily talking about the green transformation yet. Most of these investments goes to oil and coal. And the remainder that goes to renewables are not as high as it looks, actually, because China's hydropower investments, both domestically and in the BRI target regions, also constitute an often overlooked hindrance for its green strategy, because many databases in the scholarship include hydropower in the category of renewable energy. If you look at here. However, from a political ecology perspective, hydropower technologies are often detrimental to the nature and to the livelihood of the surrounding community. Moreover, China is often criticized for investing in hydropower infrastructure, meaning like building dams, lots of dams, for financial support for its construction industry. By the local entrepreneurial state, like going back to like my argument about like the relationship between domestic and international, and the relationship between the central state and local state in China, right? And it's also a geostrategic power contestation with the countries affected by the dam building, as in the case of Southeast Asia. I think we're gonna hear a lot about the problems in the Mekong River Delta because of these like hydropower projects in the coming years. So keep an eye on that. The overwhelming rate, the construction industry in the BRI scheme is often criticized. The infrastructure projects of the BRI, such as dams, highways, and other mega projects like stadiums, for example. Like if you look at Africa-China relations, you'll see there's a lot of talk about these stadiums. Are criticized since the carbon emission levels of these BRI projects are drastically high and they contribute to global warming, obviously. So if that's the case, how is it China gonna green the BRI? So if we go back to like leave the construction sector behind and go back to the energy sector, finance in the power generation sector is still dominated by hydropower and coal. And when I say dominated, I mean like 183 billions to coal and hydropower, and only 5 billion to renewables. That's a serious disparity. And within this coal investments, the 78% of it goes to the BRI countries. So the BRI countries, but not all the BRI countries, basically the lower income countries, to be more straightforward about our argument, are the main recipients of China's coal investments. And you may ask, like, how then the greening of the BRI will happen, right? And that goes back to the political ecology question that May Tan Mullins rightly asked. It's not about it's about like who gets the green within the BRI, right? So the answer is, as I'll elaborate more in a second, is the already developed countries get to be green. within the China's greening the BRI scheme. Let's go back to the lower income countries. China will now plans to sell carbon emission prevention technologies to these lower income countries who are already the recipients of the traditional or the obsolete coal technology. This is something that the environmental NGOs complain about in these developing countries, that China invests and encourages the construction of outdated technologies, which actually adds an additional layer to the carbon emissions, and also leads to an inefficiency of power production. So it's kind of like a lose-lose situation. So how is China planning to sell the green technologies to the countries that it has sold these old technologies in the first place? For example, being a green power is already in the conditionality list for the Middle East partners of the BRI since 2019, not 18, 19. The Chinese bank ICBC's Singapore headquarters launched its first green bonds of 2 billion again in 2019, and the revenue of it will be used in the BRI countries. Therefore, renewables are also projects of state building and geopolitical power projects. Let me develop this point further. Since 2012, the 25% of Chinese greenfield bottom-up investments relate to renewable energy. 45% of the mergers and acquisitions were also related to renewable energy, and 30% of mixed investments, again, in the renewable sector. These are all good numbers, but Beijing's renewable energy investments specifically target the OECD member countries in Europe. The recipients of China's renewable investments are categorized as BRI or non-BRI in the literature. However, the real gap is between the developed and developing countries. Like calling them BRI and non-BRI, in my opinion, hides the fact that the gap is between the developed and developing countries, or the higher and lower income countries. China's already limited green investments are all concentrated in higher and middle income countries at best, whereas the lower income countries continue to get the coal investment. Among the countries in which China invests in green technologies are Australia and Western Europe, and lately Southern Europe also hopped in the wagon. So you see the picture, I guess, right? There are exceptions of Pakistan and Latin America, but they are a part of a large central government, Chinese central government projects in these regions, and not private investments, and therefore sustainability of these investments is not the main concern for them, for China. The green projects are also funded by the green bonds issued by the Chinese banks. Therefore, the higher income countries are now in full circuits with China by receiving both the technologies and the investments. That's why, in the case of like Western Europe and the developed countries in Asia Pacific, it is not a dependency relationship, as showcased in the EU-China Climate Summit last year. In contrast, the lower income BRI countries' infrastructure projects are funded through regular debt and equity finance channels, and used for brown projects like coal power, oil and gas exploration, and mining. Yet, loans for these projects are still subject to green financial regulations, known as green credit guidelines, set out by China's Banking and Regulatory Commission and individual policy and commercial banks. Well, the implementation of these green credit guidelines are quite spotty and mostly ignored. Chinese lending institutions have little communication and engagement with non-government stakeholders in host countries, like the environmental NGOs, for example, and that limits their ability to enforce guidelines or ensure adequate third-party social and environmental impact assessment. Moreover, it's a lopsided relationship. As I mentioned earlier, now China imposes green conditionality on the Middle East, East Mediterranean. The green conditionality forces the target countries to purchase China's green bonds without a confirmed prospect of green investment. In fact, many countries in the MENA region witnessed stalled negotiation in green investments, or their investment deals are shadow deals, meaning they are only on paper. The domestic dynamics is also a variable in China's variegated renewable energy strategy. While we see a commitment to renewable energies at the central level, like in the case of clean coal technologies, the domestic supply market prefers to invest in the consumption side, like in the case of electronic cars. For an example for that, following the announcement of the Tech City project in Morocco, Chinese auto manufacturing companies signed agreements with the Moroccan government to build various plants. But these are all in the consumption side of the green transformation, not in the production of the energy, right? So now with these examples, we are already going into the Mediterranean region. So let me talk about that a little bit, and then I'll conclude. As you know, I hope I demonstrated clearly by now, the BRI is not a regionalization attempt based on equal access to resources like the EU or ASEAN. I mean, you might argue that like it's not the case for these two regional organizations either, but at least it is the case, at least on paper, right? In the Chinese case, it's a hub and spoke system with China at the center. We can detect patterns and explain the exceptions to those patterns with the plurality in China's policy sphere. And the Mediterranean region, in my opinion, is a case in point for that. Primary engagement Mediterranean is for transport and a very recent focus. The BRI includes the Middle East through major infrastructure investment policies, such as the Suez Canal, being central to the maritime BRI. Israel and Iran are also included in the BRI. Iran through the Tehran Railway connecting to the China-Pakistan route, and Israel through the RedMed project that aims at connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And recently, they have the Haifa port as well. Both railway projects are central to the land-bound belt part of the BRI. The BRI otherwise is primarily based on the construction industry, as exemplified in Kuwait's Turk City. China's infrastructure investment in the construction industry is a welcome development against the economic slowdown in the Arab countries, either due to the political instability after the Arab Spring or the dropping oil prices, depending on what sub-region of the Mediterranean we are talking about. Mostly private-owned enterprises account for a growing share of Chinese FDI in the European energy sector, while even the green investments in the Eastern Mediterranean are by the SOE. That again, you know, going back to the domestic determinants of China's BRI engagement, right? China's relationship with Western Europe is technology seeking and market seeking, whereas in the Mediterranean, it is either geostrategic, as in the case of the Gulf countries, or to alleviate the domestic pressure on the local SOEs, as in the case of Turkey or Egypt. Southern European countries recently joined the ranks of the recipients of China's renewable investments. Spain and Italy with solar energy, and Greece and Portugal with wind energy. The expansion of China's green investment in these countries does not necessarily indicate a major policy shift for China, though. Instead, I think they result from shifts in the market conditions domestically in these countries, such as changes in the regulatory environment and different patterns of privatization. So if we talk about the sub-region of the Eastern Mediterranean, or a new region in making with the recent discoveries of gas in Eastern Mediterranean. Now, all the regional actors are realigning. Well, not only the regional, but both regional and extra-regional actors are realigning their positions for this region, right? So I guess it is fair to call the Eastern Mediterranean the new region in the making, right? Um, China's relationship with the Eastern Mediterranean has several and sometimes contradictory factors at play. Energy transportation security. China maintains good relations with the countries that host its ports, such as Italy, Greece, and more recently Israel, to secure the maritime transportation of, um, of energy. Then we have the economic security for private enterprises investing in renewables, because both domestically and internationally, it is the private companies, as I mentioned earlier, the private companies that invest in renewable energy in China, because the SOEs, the state companies, are too big to initiate such a big transformation in their technological investment that fast. Right? But these private enterprises are not backed by the central government financially, and they're way smaller than the SOEs to survive, let's say, delays in the implementation of the investments due to the problems related to host governments, for example, right? So they are very susceptible to the economic or political instability in the target countries, unlike the SOEs, who can always be bailed out by the central government. So it's a concern for the central government still to provide a protection shield for these private enterprises investing in renewables in the region. And then there's, of course, the political security that comes into picture. I am of the opinion that a lot of Eastern Mediterranean countries do not get China's investment in energy, especially in like green cutting-edge energy, not necessarily due to a lack of infrastructure, but due to political reasons, like the unstable bilateral relations between China and Turkey due to the Uyghur issue, or well, obviously the civil war in Syria, right? And again, the civil strife in Lebanon, the aftershocks of the Arab Spring in the North African countries are all political reasons for China not to put these countries on the list of Mediterranean countries receiving green investment. Let me demonstrate my points, my last point, with a specific example. So this example is Shanghai Electric, a local state-owned enterprise based, well, obviously in Shanghai, right, as the name suggests. But also it is a subsidiary of a national electric SOE as well. So it is connected with the central government as well. This Shanghai Electric local SOE is a perfect example of a stagnating local SOE in China, which is too big to transform itself. So it has been struggling to catch up with the new energies and the BRI, the very I guess I dropped. What was the last thing you heard?
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right. We can continue. We were seeing the case. Yes.
Okay. So the case.
Yeah.
So I was talking about this Shanghai Electric, right? It is a good example of a local SOE too big to transform itself to be competitive in the BRI scheme, and it is already losing profits domestically. And if it is not like declaring bankruptcy, it's thanks to the central government bailouts. Right? It's a very typical Chinese SOE. So this SOE invest in green energies in GCC countries. It collaborates with the Aqua Renewable Energy Holding of Saudi Arabia, and the 49% of the Aqua Renewable Energy Holding is bought by China anyways. So it's a major investment collaboration between China and the GCC countries. And now the Aqua Renewable, let's say shortly, builds a clean coal plant with Harbin Electric in Dubai, and also a solar plant, as you can see from the picture, with Shanghai Electric, this old, big, stagnant SOE in China, right? And Shanghai Electric was handpicked by the central government for this investment to help the ailing SOE reinvent itself as a competitive actor in the global energy sector, right? Yet the same SOE invests in coal plant with a very outdated technology in Adana Hunutlu in Turkey. So how do we explain this contradictory behavior by the same business actor? Well, Shanghai Electric's coal commitments in Turkey predates the one in UAE, and was motivated by the SOE's overcapacity problem domestically. And it was approved by the central government of China, who avoids high-stake economic involvement with Turkey due to the political instability in bilateral relations. So I think this is a good example of how China's green investments in the Mediterranean is a patchwork for the complex interaction of multiple actors and factors. So just to conclude, China's double green transformation has multiple scales and actors to take into account. And China is an external actor in the emerging Eastern Mediterranean region, in which energy will be a determining factor in the foreseeable future. Let me stop here and let's hear what Veysal has to say about all this, because again, as I said, he comes from a BRI background. It's with the focus of foreign aid. I'll just stop here.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ceren, for this great and definitely very informative presentation. It was very forceful, and actually we ran out of time a little bit, but it's not a problem because unfortunately YouTube is not allowing us to have a wall right now. They are attacking our wall, unfortunately. So probably we will not be able to have questions from the floor, unfortunately. But if it changes, we will definitely, we still have time. We have half an hour. And if the situation changes, if it gets better, then we will get questions. If it doesn't, unfortunately, we will have the discussion among three of us. But now the floor is Veysal. So yes, Veysal, we listen to you.
Yeah, thank you, Defne. Thanks, Ceren, for your very insightful talk. And you have brought different parts of the picture to explain China's overseas green investments. Yeah, you already underlined that China's overseas energy investments overwhelmingly focused on traditional types of energy, right? Like coal energy, hydropower, even nuclear. But we still have China as a internationally, globally leading financier, investor in green technology, in emerging green technologies and investments. I also like to highlight some of your comments before moving to direct a few questions. And I like your point on BRI as a sort of domestic, as an outcome of domestic concerns, domestic problems, because in general, in IR community in general, BRI is regarded generally as a geopolitical grand strategy, etc. But China specialists are more aware, I would say, of the domestic political economic problems of China and the interconnection between these problems with the Belt and Road Initiative. So that connection, the domestic problems connection with the Belt and Road Initiative is rather pronounced in traditional energy investments of China. I think we can say so. Because after the years of investment boom, China has quite significant amount of overcapacity in coal and other energy sectors. And I also like to underline an idiosyncratic feature of China. It is, I would say, understandable to have China some overcapacity in traditional sectors like iron, coal, and some others, but it seems that China also has overcapacity in rather, advanced sectors such as green technologies, green manufacturing. That's China is atypical in many ways, and this is an interesting example of this, I would say. And also your point on distinction between the high income recipients and lower income recipients is important, I would say. So in general, lower income countries are, kind of recipients for coal investments, while the many of China's recipients of China's green investments are high income economies. And right now I am moving to questions, and I like to ask, comparative advantage of China's green investments. In the case of coal investments, we know China's comparative advantage, as you already underlined. There are large SOEs with political support, with financial support of the central government, and they have also expertise in coal investments on the back of their domestic projects. So these are the main advantages, comparative advantages of China's overseas investments in coal technologies. Also, we know that there is a shortage of coal financing right now, right? I mean, World Bank, European Investment Bank, and some other, Western development banks are refrained from financing coal investments. So these are the comparative advantages of coal investments, as far as I understand. Can you tell a bit more about the comparative advantages of China's green investments and financing? Can you compare the comparative advantage of China's green and the gray overseas investments and financing?
Oh, you mean, is the question about like comparing China's comparative advantages in green investment vis-a-vis the brown investment, brown-gray investment, or other green investors?
I think we already get from your presentation the comparative advantages of the gray, brown, etc. investments. Can you elaborate more on the comparative advantages of China's green overseas investments and financing? Yeah.
Well, that's a very good question, actually. Why would the developing or developed countries even buy from China, right? While all other countries are also investing the same technologies, and they also have green bonds as well, right? So China is not alone in the market, even though now it is dominating the market. It is not alone, right? Like the Scandinavian countries, big players, and all
Germany.
that. The reason why the developing countries see China as more advantageous vis-a-vis let's say, the Western European alternatives is they perceive China's involvement in the green industry in general, both the production side and the financial side, as easier to engage with than the Western European counterparts. What I mean with this easiness of China is that China's guidelines and regulations are not as strict as the EU's or the UN's, for that matter, or they are perceived as such. I mean, there's a truth in that, because China's the guidelines are not really imposed neither on the domestic green companies nor in the host countries. But there's also some of it is also the perception of it. Like, for example, Turkey now has a clean energy agenda that doesn't mention the Paris Agreement even once. Why? Because Turkey signed the agreement, but didn't ratify it in the parliament. So it's not a party to the agreement, right? And since it's not a party to the agreement, it cannot use the funds coming from Europe, either the EU funds or the individual European country funds, like from France and whatnot. And the reason why Turkey didn't ratify the agreement is because Turkey was categorized as a developed country. So it was not allowed to use the funds allocated for the developing countries. And Turkish government claimed that Turkey is still a developing country when it comes to green energy investment, and it should be in the developing category, right? When that didn't happen, Turkey didn't sign the agreement. Now it is totally, entirely deprived of the funds available for it, right? And of course, on the side, since it's not a party to the agreement, it doesn't feel obliged to comply with the European or the UN guidelines either. And Turkey has been requesting China's green investment in Turkey throughout this conflict with the EU and the UN, thinking that China would provide Turkey with the funds, with the generous funds that the UN and the EU are depriving it of, right? And also the expectation is that China's guidelines and or the implementation of these regulations would be looser than the EU or other Western countries, because the companies, the private companies, the business sector in the energy sector in Turkey lobbies to the government not to adopt these high-cost technologies, because transition to these like green technologies will be too costly for the energy sector. So there's this like business lobby in Turkey that is pushing it for China. And in this particular case, Chinese investment, green investment, is not happening. Again, I think it's because of political reasons more than Turkey's potential as a green collaborator to China. But I give this as an example of how China is perceived as advantageous over the Western European counterparts. And I'm not, partly that's true, but I'm not sure if China continues to be a climate leader, especially with the new 5-year plan and with the commitment to carbon neutrality, if the regulations will be really continue to be looser than the Western counterparts. I think it is more on the perception side of things, more than actual reality, but this is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So the attractiveness of Chinese financing again comes with its Chinese financing in green technology comes with its, how to say, its loose regulations, or its not being stringent about the environmental or financial safeguards. And also, yeah. And also that brings an important question for the, power implications of this kind of cooperation between China and developing countries like Turkey. Clearly, China's cooperating with China on financing side undermine, at least somewhat undermine the relative power of Western financing institutions over developing countries, because now they can say we have an alternative. We can cooperate with them, like China and Chinese. So that's again an interesting part of the these emerging partnerships with China and developing countries. And I like to raise another question. I know that that's kind of a big question, but maybe you can tell something about it. As you already framed, there's a kind of coordinated investment regime in the case of coal investments in BRI countries, like policy banks, large SOEs, and the central ministries, embassies are all somehow part of those large coal investments in recipient countries. So there's a kind of coordinated investment regime behind these coal investments. But in the case of green investments, if I'm not wrong, there are smaller players, not SOEs, and some, the composition of the green sector in China is more complex, I guess. There are some SOEs as well as some private companies, as you say. So one of the advantages of this China's overseas investments, that being a coordinated investment regime, seem to be not present in the case of green investments. Can we say so, or it's a bit overstretching the things you said?
It's not an overstatement, but it is something in the making, I think. You're right that the traditional energy investments are pretty much all set now. Like there's a template, right? That the policy bank, SOE, and the embassy as like the official guarantor, right? And the embassy, and on the other side, even if a private business actor is involved, the Chinese side always requires the presence of representatives of the state, like some representatives from the Minister of Energy or Economy or whatnot, right? So there is the scheme, as you said, and we don't see the same structure in the renewable energy investments. That's true. It's partly because most of these renewable energy investments are not in the developing countries, but in developed countries. Like Germany is like the biggest recipient of China's renewable energy investments. France, UK, Scotland, right? So these, Australia in the Asia Pacific, right? So these are all like major powers, and with more liberalized financial systems, let's say. That's like one factor. Another factor, as you also said, and we discussed in my presentation, most of the actors, business actors, investing in Western Europe, Australia, the UK, are private companies, which kind of breaks this already established policy bank, SOE, embassy structure. Right? Well, that's not the case, for example, in the GCC countries. It's the Shanghai Electric and the Harbin Electric involved with aqua renewable energies. So it is actually pretty much like the traditional energy investment scheme. Again, the Policy Bank, SOE, and the Embassy formula. But in Western Europe um, and in other places, this structure is not settled yet. And now that like the Southern European, Western Mediterranean countries are also involved in it, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy. So they are kind of like the in-between countries, right? So it will be interesting to observe, I think, how the Southern European countries will handle the Chinese renewable energy investments. Like, do you see what I mean? On the one hand, we have like the UK and Germany, and the other hand, we have the GCC countries, right? One is like totally privatized, one is totally SOE based. And we have now a very recent development, the Southern European countries, kind of in between. They are European, right? In the sense that their financial regimes are liberalized, but their economies also suffer from several economic shocks and not stable enough for China to try an entirely privatized endeavor. Right. So I think China will also figure out as it goes, and the Southern European investments will be a test ground for the future endeavors.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, quite.
Can I say something about the financial institutions that you didn't formulate as a question, but I think you made a very good point about the role of the financial institutions. China's BRI and like now the issuing of the green bonds by both the Central Bank of China and the big national commercial banks like ICBC also undermines the financial institutions, right? Like the WTO, for example. China totally bypasses the WTO rules and regulations in its green investment in Western Europe. Like anti-monopoly rules and everything. China has this like freeway through that. But I think it's only partly because of China's forceful involvement in the field, but also the withdrawal of the US from all these international venues during the Trump administration. Like the US withdrawal from the TPP, its own international arrangements, killed it, right? And it killed all the transnational networks that could constrain China in the Asia Pacific, for example. So on the one hand, China is very forcefully getting involved, but on the other hand, it also has an empty field to play.
Yeah.
And it might change under the Biden administration. It's something definitely to observe in the coming years. But that's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer.
So, well, I have some good news. The wall is now open. So if there are any, questions from the audience, they are very welcome to write them down, and we will pose them to Ceren, to our speaker. And well, in the meanwhile, I would like to pose a few questions. I would like to exploit my position. Well, we mentioned about the division between developing and developed status of the recipient countries and how it determines how it has an effect on whether it's whether the investment is green or brown that they receive from China. So about the green side and the increase in the renewable technologies, China's increasing the green investments in the developed countries. So do you think what is the source? The source is rather the external pressure, I mean the recipients countries' pressure on China, or is it rather the market opportunities that exist there because the market opportunities are green? China is actually exploiting them. So what is the source? And I also wonder if there is any internal pressure within China that is actually trying to green, Chinese foreign investments.
So what are the sources of China's green term?
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Where are the sources?
yeah.
Where are the sources coming from?
So that's a very good question, actually. So I think in this like green transformation, not only for China, but internationally, globally, there are two aspects. One is the normative part of it, like with the climate summit and Greta and, and everything. Like, I mean, it is very real, right? That we are not going to survive this century, most probably, if we go like that. Right, but there's also a very material, let's say, dimension to it. Again, not only for China but for all the global actors, that all these like renewable technologies and the investment is now becoming a new um, a new um, new venue for the neoliberal capitalism, which has been going through serious bottlenecks, serious existential crises, let's say, in the last decades, to solve its structural problems. Like I see, like one of the fields, emerging fields that can save the neoliberal financialization is the green investments, investment in green technology, and the second is the digital transformation. The green transformation and digital transformation. These are the two fields that the over-financialized neoliberal system is now heading towards to actually avoid a new major crisis, economic financial crisis. So in this sense, the pressures on China to initiate its own green transformation comes from these two sources, in my opinion. On the one hand, there's obviously this normative dimension, right? China has been the major pollutant of the entire planet Earth, right? And it had to stop at some point. For the sake of all the living on this planet. So there was pressure both from outside and from within to China, like the environmental NGOs, international organizations like the UN, obviously UNDP, but also like regional organizations like ASEAN. ASEAN is a very environmentally concerned regional organization in Southeast Asia, and it was pressuring, the East Asia Forum that China what has been pressuring China to curb its polluting economic activities. And domestically, as I mentioned earlier, like the biggest grassroots activism in China since the 90s is in the environmental realm. Because the pollution, like the air pollution, the contamination of the waters, the waste recycling issue directly affects the livelihood of the people, or like the building of the dams in Southwest China. Like these directly harm the people's lives and their future. So environmental activism is really big in China. It is like the strongest NGOs are in the environmental. So there is this so the Chinese government is sandwiched between the domestic pressure for green transformation and the international normative pressure to green its economy, right? But on the other the pillar of this global green transformation, again, China is not immune to global financial economic crises, right? It so far successfully managed to avoid the direct effects of the Asian financial crisis in '97 and the global financial crisis after the North American one in 2008, thanks to its regulated banking sector, but it might not avoid the third one, right? Because it is becoming a central economic actor in a global neoliberal system, right? So, and China is not, and China is a systemic player, unlike what like the Cold War hawkish scholars in the States these days claim it is a systemic player. It doesn't want to alter, right? It doesn't want to go back to the socialist system. It doesn't want to like change the system to even to state capitalism, I think. It is a part, well, as I call it, a neoliberal developmental state. It is a part of the neoliberal system. And the survival of the neoliberal system is the survival of China. And therefore, it also has like material stakes in investing in green bonds, the green finances, for example. In developing the green financial markets, basically. So yeah, the pressures are twofold, I think.
Thank you very much. So two short questions. We have just a little of time. So do you think there was any environmental movement, against any, investment that China has made so far in the Mediterranean, countries?
That's a very good question, Defne. And it's a question that pushes me towards having this discussion more from a political ecology perspective. And I would love to do that. But I'm not aware of environmental protests against China in the Mediterranean. We see environmental protests against the BRI investments in Latin America and Southeast Asia, understandably because these two regions have significantly greater proportions of China's green or brown energy investments. So they are impacted more. And there are really strong grassroots opposition to China's energy investments, like in Myanmar, Myanmar, in Malaysia. In Malaysia, the construction of the CEZ actually stopped due to the grassroots protests. Or Sri Lanka, also, it was like one of the signature projects of China, and it is like really facing domestic opposition. And in Latin America, which already has a tradition of activism, Chinese businesses are having a hard time. But in the Mediterranean, I don't actually see environmental protests, interestingly. For example, again, I'm going to give the same example from Adana Hunuplu, that recently, a couple of months ago, several internationally connected environmental NGOs came together to launch a campaign against the Adana Hunuplu coal plant funded by China, Shanghai Electric, and that didn't trigger any grassroots support. I'm not saying that the Chinese, Turkish public opinion supports the idea, but it didn't generate any grassroots or activist support. And the local citizenry, local population, Adana, definitely supports the construction of the plant because they see it as an employment opportunity. I think the reason why we don't see much environmental protest in the Eastern Mediterranean, at least, is because they are employment concerns come before the environmental concerns in that part of the region. And of course, that question deserves much more on the ground fieldwork-based research than that.
Thank you very much. My last question, short again, it's a more state-based question. I wonder if there is any countries that China is strategically sort of excluding from investing, that is not really commonly investing in the Mediterranean. It can be green or brown. For instance, I don't see so much France within the list, but if you're aware of any strategic choices that China make for the Mediterranean region.
That's also a very good question because it's actually reflects the patchwork nature of the BRI involvement in the Mediterranean, well, everywhere actually. All the regions suffer from this variegated picture. But in the Mediterranean, I observe, the Mediterranean politics is not my area of expertise, but I observe that Turkey and Lebanon are like two countries that are excluded from the green investments. Lebanon has a tentative agreement with China in 2012, but it looks more like a shadow deal that one of the SOEs in China made this shadow deal to show in their finances, but it actually never happened. Right, and for the Turkish case, as I said like earlier when I was answering a different question, Turkish government has been requesting, like inviting green investment to Turkey over and over in the last like decade, but it's not happening. Turkey really wants to get into this offshore wind plants with Chinese investment, and that's budget allocation within the BRI just went to Italy recently. So both Lebanon and Turkey are for political reasons. The political instability domestically, and in the Turkish case also the tumultuous relationship between the two countries over the last couple of decades. For France, that's an interesting one because it is in like the Southern Europe part of the Mediterranean, right? So why France is not included in the recent green investment in Southern Europe, for example, is a good question. Again, I'm going like far beyond my area of expertise, but my I reckon it is also politically related. That the French government has been a very openly critical of the Chinese government in the international venues over almost a decade, which puts, I think, France on the list of politically not unreliable countries.
Okay, thank you very much. For now, I don't see any questions on the wall. Then I would like to ask Veysal, if he has any more questions to pose to Ceren. Oh, I think your microphone is, turned on. Yeah, now it's on.
Thanks. So far, I learned much from your talk and the Q&A session. And actually, I have another meeting. With apologies, I have to leave now.
There also, yes. Okay. So we are very thankful, that you carried China to Turkey today. I think Ceren is in China right now, right? Yes. So we are sending our thanks to China and also to Eskişehir. It was a very, insightful and informative session, informative discussion. I hope our audience later on will also find it very useful and, interesting. So thank you very much once again for joining us today for a discussion about Chinese green investments in the Mediterranean Sea. Thank you, Veysal. Thank you, Ceren.
Thank you too.
Have a very good day. Have a sunny day and healthy day. Thank you.